The fog hung low over the Barents Sea, a pale grey shroud through which the convoy PQ-18 crept like a caravan of ghosts. 35 merchant ships, laden with the material lifeblood of a distant war, ploughed through a world of steel-cold water and drifting ice. Their holds were packed with crates stamped U.S. Army, truck, 2.5-ton, 6x6, model U.S.6, Studebaker Corp. Each box represented a promise, a piece of an arsenal whose reach now stretched from Detroit to Archangel. Above them, the aurora flickered green against the blackness, as if the northern lights themselves were watching the slow birth of a global alliance. Below deck, a boatswain from Duluth scribbled in his journal, "Sea temperature 31 degrees. Escort reports U-boat contact. Depth charges echo like thunder under the ice. The convoy's escort, the British destroyers HMS Onslow and Obedient, zigzagged along the flanks, sonar pings rippling through the hulls. German aircraft from Banach and Bardufoss would strike soon. Everyone aboard knew it. They had seen the burnt wrecks of PQ-17, the massacre convoy, only months earlier. But this time, Admiral Burnett's orders were clear. No ship turns back. By autumn 1942, the Lend-Lease lifeline to the Soviet Union had become the most complex logistical network in history. 3 arteries fed the Red Army, the Arctic route to Murmansk and Archangel, fast, direct and deadly. The Persian corridor, stretching from the Persian Gulf through Iran and into the Caucasus. The Pacific route, where American freighters delivered supplies to Vladivostok under the neutral flag of the Soviet merchant fleet. Through these channels, American trucks began their slow migration east. The Studebaker US6s, the GMCC-CKW, and the Dodge WC were soon as familiar to Soviet soldiers as the Mosin Nagant rifle. But in 1942 they were still a novelty, crates of iron optimism sailing through German crosshairs. The first 2,000 trucks shipped via the Persian corridor were assembled under British supervision at Abadan and driven north through scorching deserts. "American engines don't like the sand," one Soviet mechanic complained in his diary, "but they drink less fuel than ours." From there, the vehicles joined endless columns that wound through Tabriz and into the Caucasus, each route guarded by British, Soviet and American sentries standing under different flags, but the same exhaustion. On the morning of September 13, 1942, the convoy PQ-18 was sighted by Luftwaffe reconnaissance near Bear Island. Within hours, 30 Ju-88s bombers of Kampfgeschwader 30 swooped low out of the northern fog, their engines shrieking. Merchant ship Mary Luckenbach took a direct hit and vanished in a column of flame. But unlike PQ-17, the escorts held formation, guns blazing. A sailor aboard the Liberty ship Nathaniel Greene later told U.S. Navy interrogators, "The sea turned orange from burning oil. But we kept our course. Orders said the cargo was for Stalin. We knew what that meant. That cargo was 1,000 Studebaker trucks, disassembled into crates plus engines, tyres and machine tools. Each ship's manifest read like a mechanical epic, 9,200 crates of automotive parts, 3,000 drums of lubricants, 12,000 spark plugs, 400 tons of gasoline additives. When PQ-18 limped into Murmansk 6 days later, 17 of its 35 ships were damaged, but the majority of the cargo survived. For Soviet dockworkers watching the battered convoy arrive through sleet and smoke, it was more than a delivery. It was a revelation. A worker named Yelena Frolova recalled in a post-war oral history, "They opened the crates and out came these shining engines. We'd never seen such machining, such finish. Even the grease smelled different." From the ice-choked ports, the crates were loaded onto narrow-gauge rail cars bound for Archangel and Yaroslavl. Soviet Transportation Ministry reports from October 1942 list the first serial numbers of American vehicles assembled at the Archangel Automotive Plant number, 401, 10,000 units within 6 weeks. The paperwork bears the neat mechanical handwriting of a dispatcher named Major V.K. Rudnikov. That single line, units 10,000 Studebakers, would in retrospect mark the turning point of Soviet mobility. What had once been an infantry army was beginning to acquire wheels. From Archangel southward, the trucks were assembled in makeshift depots staffed by Soviet apprentices and American advisors from the Lend-Lease Maintenance Group. Many had never met before, some shared only fragments of language. But the instructions were simple enough. Bolt A to frame B, tighten with wrench C. The first Studebaker engine coughed to life on October 19, 1942, its exhaust curling into the Arctic air like a banner. By early November, long convoys of newly assembled trucks were rumbling down forest roads, bound for Moscow and the Central Front. Photographs from the U.S. Army Signal Corps archive show lines of olive-drab vehicles crossing the frozen northern Divina, their tires wrapped in chains, their cabs dusted with frost. Soviet drivers christened them affectionately Studa, a foreign word reshaped to Russian lips. A dispatch from the 2nd Guards Army, dated November 22nd, records their first field test. The American vehicles have greater load capacity than ZIS-5, capable of maintaining 30 km per hour on snow-covered roads, fuel consumption acceptable. It was the understatement of a century. Those trucks would soon haul artillery, fuel, and even Katyusha rocket batteries across half of Europe. Yet every vehicle delivered bore the weight of blood and distance. The British Admiralty's loss tables for 1942 show 104 merchant ships sunk on the Arctic route alone, an attrition rate of 12%. Every fourth truck we sent went to the bottom, wrote U.S. Navy historian Rear Admiral Morrison, but the rest rolled into Russia. At the Persian Gulf ports, Iranian labourers worked under floodlights to unload cargo 24 hours a day. The heat reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit. At night, scorpions crept into the crates. The trucks smelled of salt when they arrived, of dust when they left, an American quartermaster noted. It was the geography of an alliance. From Vladivostok, ships under Soviet registry ferried more supplies across the Trans-Siberian line. Japan, still officially at peace with Moscow, watched but did not interfere. By the end of 1942, more than 45,000 trucks had been delivered through all three routes combined, a logistical feat unmatched in human history. Winter 1942–43. Somewhere near Voronezh, an artillery unit of the 5th Guards Army stood ankle-deep in snow beside a column of brand-new Studebakers. Their commander, Colonel Ivan Andreev, recorded in his operations log, received 37 American 2.5-ton vehicles. Drivers report high reliability. No need to heat carburetors overnight. Capable of carrying Katyusha launchers. Excellent. When dawn came, the convoy rolled forward through smoke and snow toward the front. The road was littered with the wrecks of Soviet trucks burned out during the summer retreat. The new ones, foreign, unfamiliar, yet indispensable, carried the Red Army's lifeblood toward the battlefields of Kursk and Kharkov. For the first time, the Soviet High Command could imagine an offensive sustained not just by courage and railways, but by wheels. The arsenal of democracy had crossed the oceans and arrived in time. By the spring thaw of 1943, the Studebaker had become more than a shipment manifest. It was a living machine rumbling across the Russian steppe, a creature that adapted to its new environment. The Red Army drivers called it simply the Studa, short, blunt, and affectionate. It rolled with a confident growl, its exhaust breath turning to vapour in the frigid dawn, its tyres biting into mud and snow that no Soviet-made truck dared to challenge. The Studebaker US6s had been designed for the U.S. Army's own logistics corps, a 2.5-ton, 6x6 cargo truck built for hauling fuel, ammunition, and men across deserts, jungles, or tundra. But on the Eastern Front, it earned a second identity, as the heart of motion for the Red Army. Soviet engineers inspected the American truck with suspicion when it first arrived. It was complex, finely tuned, and painted in a strange green, not quite matching Soviet olive drab. But once the engines roared to life, skepticism melted like frost. "The Americans must have known our roads were made of rivers," one Soviet mechanic joked, tightening a bolt near the wheel hub. "This thing swims through mud like a fish." Reports from the 339th Fighter Squadron and Lend-Lease Depot Number 9 at Murmansk confirmed what the soldiers already knew. The Studebaker's performance exceeded expectations. In icy conditions that crippled the GAZ, AA or ZIS-5, the American trucks could haul double the payload, move faster, and require fewer repairs. They were, in essence, the arteries of movement for an army that depended on speed to survive. By the summer of 1943, entire Red Army logistics columns were being refitted with Studebakers. Painted over with Cyrillic serial numbers, they carried everything: fuel drums, 82mm mortar shells, spare T-34 track links, even wounded soldiers on stretchers strapped to wooden benches. Soviet documents recovered from the 4th Tank Army Archives list 1,268 Studebakers fully motorized, assigned to Operation Kutuzov, the follow-up offensive after Kursk. But beyond numbers, the trucks changed something deeper. They transformed the psychology of mobility. On a frozen morning outside Orel, a convoy of 60 Studebakers assembled at the edge of a pine forest. The drivers were young, many just farm boys drafted from Siberia or Ukraine. Each truck bore a hand-painted slogan, "Za Pobedu," for victory. The lead driver, Senior Sergeant Viktor Melnikov, carried a worn photograph of his wife tucked behind the speedometer glass. His convoy's mission was simple: deliver 50 tons of fuel and munitions to a forward tank regiment cut off by German counterattacks. "Keep the spacing," he barked through a scarf wrapped over his mouth. 2 truck lengths, no lights. The Luftwaffe still hunts the roads. The Studebakers started forward, their 6-wheel drive clawing through snow so deep that horses would have sunk to the axles. A distant rumble echoed, German artillery probing the horizon. When they reached the ravine that German engineers had blown open days earlier, Melnikov faced a decision. Soviet-made trucks would have turned back, but his American-made convoy didn't. The lead truck downshifted, engine growling, and climbed the far slope like a steel animal. The others followed in formation, slipping and jerking, but climbing. The Studebaker's flexible suspension and torque made it almost unnatural. It was as if the truck was bred for the Russian front. They reached the encircled tank unit at dusk. The commander, his T-34 half covered in snow, stared at the incoming headlights. "You made it? Over that ravine? In this weather?" Melnikov grinned. "Blame the Americans." In Moscow, Soviet logistics officers began compiling field reports for the State Defense Committee. The findings were astonishing. Lend-Lease vehicles now represented more than 30% of all motorized transport in Red Army service. Of these, nearly half were American trucks, and the majority Studebaker US6 models. One report, dated October 1943, concluded, "Without these machines, we could not sustain our offensive tempo beyond the Don. Domestic production cannot meet requirements of distance, speed, and tonnage." Even the Soviet press, usually cautious about foreign acknowledgement, began to hint at their importance. Krasnaya Zvezda published an understated photo of a Studebaker column crossing a pontoon bridge. The caption simply read, "Roads to Victory." The Germans noticed too. Captured intelligence memos from the Wehrmacht's Army Group Center observed that Soviet units now move and supply themselves with surprising speed, using Anglo-American trucks of various types. For a German army fighting on fumes, this mobility was terrifying. By late 1943, Studebakers weren't just hauling supplies, they were being transformed into weapons. Soviet engineers realized that the truck's long flatbed was perfect for mounting Katyusha rocket launchers. The BM-13N launcher, previously fitted on the fragile ZIS chassis, now sat atop the stronger American frame. The result was devastating. Frontline soldiers called them White Death on wheels. The sound of multiple rockets firing from a Studebaker was a mechanical scream that shook the forest. U.S. Air Force observers later noted in their debriefing reports that the Studebaker became the backbone of Soviet rocket artillery mobility during the last 2 years of the war. At the Air Force Historical Research Agency, a note from an American liaison officer recorded, "The Soviets seem especially attached to the Studebaker 6x6. I witnessed them loading Katyusha rails on it like boys playing with toys, and then driving it straight into mud where no jeep could follow. For Soviet truck drivers, the Studebaker was more than steel. It was a companion. It didn't freeze up at minus 30 degrees Celsius. Its starter motor turned even after days of frost. And its heaters, luxuries by Russian standards, were a revelation." In one post-war memoir, driver Natalia Krylova recalled her first convoy in a Studebaker. It was green and heavy and smelled of oil and salt, as if it had just crossed an ocean. I had driven GAZ trucks before, but this was different. The seats were soft. The gears changed without grinding. When we drove through sleet, I felt like the machine wanted to live. By the end of 1943, more than 90,000 Studebakers had reached Soviet soil. Another 20,000 were en route through the Persian corridor, guarded by U.S. Navy convoys from Basra to Tehran. Each represented a fragment of the arsenal of democracy, reshaped into the lifeblood of an advancing army. The Japanese 4th Air Group War Diary, captured in 1945, even noted the phenomenon from afar. The Soviets are moving faster than expected in Europe. Our observers report American trucks at the forefront of their supply lines. Back in the U.S.A., in a smoky garage outside Smolensk, a mechanic scrawled on a wall in chalk, "The Studa does not die." And indeed, it didn't. Those trucks, shipped in crates across oceans, dragged through snow and swamp, carrying men and shells to the front, would survive years beyond the war. But in 1943, as the Red Army prepared for the greatest offensives yet to come, one fact had become undeniable. The road to Berlin would be paved not only by courage and blood, but by 400,000 wheels stamped Made in U.S.A. By June 1944, the Red Army was no longer crawling. It was roaring. Operation Bagration, the code name for Stalin's Great Summer Offensive, aimed to destroy Germany's Army Group Center and reclaim Belarus in one massive strike. What the generals knew, but few outside their war rooms understood, was that the real weapon of Bagration wasn't just tanks or artillery. It was motion, and motion depended on trucks. When the Stavka approved the final operational plan in May, logistics officers gathered in a smoke-filled room at the Kremlin to study a single terrifying equation: how to move 2.3 million men, 4,000 tanks, and 30,000 artillery pieces across 400 miles of devastated terrain faster than the Germans could retreat. Railways were shattered, bridges were gone, horses could not keep pace. What remained was a growing fleet of American trucks, most of them Studebakers and GMCs, arriving in the thousands each month through the Persian corridor. Colonel Ivan Goryunov, chief of logistics for the 3rd Belarusian Front, later recalled in a 1962 interview at the U.S.-Soviet Symposium, "We had more faith in those trucks than in our maps." The Studebaker was not afraid of rain, shell holes, or marshes. Without them, we would have advanced 10 kilometers a day instead of 40. In the lead-up to Bagration, Lend-Lease supply trains unloaded near Gorky and Smolensk, where Soviet engineers repainted the trucks, adjusted the carburetors for low-octane fuel, and filled the cargo beds with oil drums, spare track links, and boxes of rifle ammunition. A captured German aerial photograph from June 12, 1944, shows endless columns of trucks stretching across the Smolensk plains, hundreds of olive-green specks cutting new scars into the steppe. As the offensive began on June 22nd, the anniversary of Hitler's invasion 3 years earlier, German frontline commanders were stunned by the Red Army's sudden acceleration. The Wehrmacht's intelligence summaries recorded unusual depth of supply mobility, noting that Soviet truck convoys operate directly behind tank spearheads. Those convoys were almost entirely American-made. At a forward staging point near Vitebsk, Captain Yuri Karpov supervised a mobile fuel column of 92 Studebakers. His orders: keep the T-34s moving no matter what. He remembered the ground trembling as the tanks roared past. Every 30 minutes, another battalion, each one guzzling hundreds of litres of fuel. When the armoured spearhead outran its railhead, Karpov's convoy became the lifeline. "We followed them like a shadow," he said. "They fought, we fed them. Our wheels were their stomachs." For 3 days, Karpov's column drove through smoke and shattered roads, refuelling tanks directly under artillery fire. The trucks absorbed shrapnel and mud but kept rolling. One driver, shot through the arm, refused evacuation. He tied his sleeve with wire and drove with one hand until the next supply stop. In a debriefing report preserved in the 13th Fighter Command archives, an American observer attached to the Soviet 1st Tank Army wrote, "Their supply chain runs almost entirely on U.S. vehicles. I have counted Studebakers, Dodges and Chevrolets carrying rockets, gasoline and even bread. These convoys move like a mechanized bloodstream." Meanwhile, the German situation collapsed. Within 10 days, Soviet spearheads broke through, encircling entire divisions at Vitebsk and Bobruisk. The Wehrmacht's retreat turned chaotic as the Red Army advanced at rates unheard of on the Eastern Front. General Heinz Guderian, in his post-war interrogation, admitted, "They achieved a level of operational speed we did not believe possible. Their motor transport columns, many of them American, neutralized our ability to regroup. We could not destroy their logistics fast enough." The statistics bore him out. Soviet reports from July 1944 logged 2,300 tons of fuel and 1,800 tons of ammunition delivered per day to the First Belarusian Front, nearly triple the 1942 average. The trucks formed mobile pipelines, linking depots hundreds of kilometers apart. They carried not just supplies, but prisoners, medical units, and even mobile command posts. Near Mogilev, a makeshift headquarters operated entirely out of a convoy of 20 Studebakers fitted with radio sets and field tables. Soviet dispatchers joked that Stalin's armies now travelled with offices on wheels. In the towns they liberated, civilians often mistook the trucks for American troops. A Belarusian farmer recalled seeing the stars on the hubcaps and shouting, "The Americans have come!" Soldiers laughed and corrected him, but deep down, even hardened commissars felt the irony. "Capitalist machines carrying socialist victory," muttered a political officer as he climbed onto a tailgate loaded with fuel drums. History has a strange sense of humour. The irony didn't stop the gratitude. When the Fifth Army liberated Minsk in early July, its supply trucks were the first to roll into the city square. Drivers stood on their hoods waving red flags, their engines still idling. Behind them came T-34s, artillery, and endless columns of infantry. The trucks had reached where railways could not. In Washington, a quiet cable arrived at the War Department. Operation Bagration successful. Soviet Army mobility greatly enhanced by Lend-Lease motor transport. No press releases, no headlines. The world was still focused on Normandy, unaware that the largest defeat in German military history was unfolding thousands of miles away, powered by Detroit steel. In August, after Minsk fell and the front pushed toward Poland, Soviet mechanics began a grim ritual, stripping destroyed Studebakers for usable parts. The convoy losses were heavy, roads cratered by bombs, bridges collapsing under weight, constant Luftwaffe strafing. But even wrecked, the trucks were cannibalized and reborn. Axles were welded to new frames. Engines swapped overnight. A single surviving truck might bear parts from 6 others. By now, the Red Army's motor pool had become a mosaic of nations: American chassis, Soviet trailers, British tyres, Persian oil. It was a coalition of machinery held together by mud and necessity. In a letter preserved in the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey archives, an American officer stationed in Tehran wrote, "Every Studebaker that leaves this depot becomes a soldier. It will fight in its own way, hauling shells, ferrying wounded, carrying bread. Some won't return, but those that do will have seen more of the war than any man." By September 1944, the Red Army stood on the Vistula River, staring toward Warsaw and Berlin beyond it. Their tanks were dented, their men exhausted, but their supply lines, astonishingly, were still intact. Soviet generals toasted that fall to the trucks that had carried them from the Dnieper to the Vistula. In a post-war symposium, General Konev admitted, half smiling, "When I first heard of American trucks in 1942, I laughed. By 1944 I blessed them. They were our cavalry. That cavalry, 400,000 engines of democracy, had done what centuries of history could not, moved the Russian army across the heart of Europe. And behind every thrust of steel and fire, somewhere in the smoke, the growl of a Studebaker echoed on the wind." By the spring of 1945, the roads of Europe had turned to rivers of mud, rubble, and exhaustion. From the Oder to the Spree, the final 100 kilometres to Berlin were the most brutal stretch of all, a shattered landscape of burned villages, cratered bridges, and retreating German columns fighting to the last. Yet amid this chaos, the Red Army's machine never stopped moving. Its steel heart was not only in its tanks or artillery, but in the unrelenting hum of its trucks, thousands upon thousands of American-made Studebakers and GMCS grinding forward day and night. The Germans could still hear them even when no tanks were near. In interrogation reports taken by the Allies after the war, captured officers recalled the strange mechanical chorus that echoed through the forests. "We heard them before we saw them," said one colonel of the 9th Army. "A deep growl in the night, dozens of engines, perfectly synchronized. They moved closer each day. The Soviets had built a road out of sound. That road began on the shores of Murmansk 3 years earlier. Now it stretched to the gates of Berlin." When the Vistula-Oder offensive began in January 1945, the Soviet advance stunned even its own planners. The Red Army surged more than 300 miles in just 23 days, smashing through German defences in Poland and reaching the Oder River by February. It was one of the fastest large-scale advances in modern history, and it was sustained almost entirely by Lend-Lease motor transport. Railways were useless in the chaos. Tracks were twisted from bombings, and bridges were demolished. Horses froze in the snow or collapsed from exhaustion. But the Studebaker columns kept rolling, fueled by Persian gasoline and maintained with spare parts shipped across 3 continents. Colonel Pavel Yefimovich, a logistics commander in Zhukov's First Belarusian Front, kept a small notebook throughout the offensive. Decades later, it was found in his family's attic and archived at the National World War II Museum. On one page, smudged with grease, he wrote, "The Germans thought our tanks were the threat. They never realized our greatest weapon had 6 wheels." His notes described how convoys of 300 to 400 trucks ran in rotation, ferrying everything from diesel drums to bread to entire mobile hospitals. A single Studebaker could carry enough ammunition for an artillery battery's day of fire, or, if modified, haul a 122mm howitzer itself. At the Oder crossing near Kustrin, Yefimovich's men worked under German shell fire, bridging the river with pontoons lashed together by engineers. As soon as the bridge could hold, the first vehicle to cross wasn't a tank, it was a Studebaker. Its driver, Corporal Mikhail Burenko, later said in a post-war interview, "They told us to wait for the armour. I didn't. The soldiers needed food. The bridge groaned under us, but she made it. Behind Burenko came hundreds more. By the third night, the west bank of the Oder glowed with the lights of engines. Soviet officers looked across at Germany's heartland and realized the final march had begun. Inside Berlin, the situation was collapsing. Hitler's staff was trapped in their own delusion, issuing phantom orders to divisions that no longer existed. Meanwhile, Soviet trucks churned ceaselessly through the mud and ruin, bridging the gap between the front and the depots in Poland. To the soldiers, they were a familiar sight, dusty, battered and loyal. Many had been patched together countless times with scavenged parts and improvised bolts. The side doors were dented from years of service, the dashboards plastered with icons, photographs and faded American labels that no one could read. Private Pyotr Kravchenko, a Studebaker driver from the 3rd Guards Army, described one night in April 1945 when he and his convoy entered the ruins of a German village under artillery fire. The sky was red. The air stank of smoke and spring. We could see the fires of Berlin on the horizon. Every road was broken, but the truck climbed over rubble like a tank. I thought then, it wasn't just us going to Berlin. The truck wanted to go too. Kravchenko's story matched hundreds of others. Drivers often named their vehicles like comrades: Anya, Victory, Steel Mare. Some painted white stars on the doors as good luck charms. Others wrote slogans, "To Berlin or Bust," in Cyrillic over the faded U.S. Army markings. On April 16, 1945, the Red Army launched its final assault on Berlin. The thunder of 20,000 guns shook the ground, and over 1 million Soviet soldiers began their push toward the city. Behind them followed the convoys, long columns of trucks snaking through the smoke, headlights blacked out, drivers steering by instinct and flame. In the command post near the Silo Heights, Marshal Georgy Zhukov stood beside his chief of staff, watching the endless procession of vehicles. "Whose trucks are those?" he asked. "Mostly American, Comrade Marshal," came the answer. Zhukov grunted, almost smiling. "Then may they hurry, or we'll run out of shells before breakfast." By dawn, Soviet infantry and tanks had breached the first German defensive lines. As they advanced, trucks rolled forward immediately behind the artillery, bringing fresh ammunition. One Studebaker, its windshield shattered, carried entire crates of Katyusha rockets straight into the bombardment zone. Its driver never made it out alive, but his cargo reached the launchers, which continued firing. This was how the Red Army operated now, a continuous tide of movement. If a bridge fell, engineers built a new one overnight. If a truck was destroyed, another took its place before the smoke cleared. The entire machine pulsed forward, relentless, inevitable. In the chaos of April 25th, when Soviet and American forces met at the Elbe River, it was again the trucks that marked the moment. Photographs from that day show Soviet soldiers shaking hands with U.S. troops beside a Studebaker with 2 Berlin scrawled on its hood. The irony was poetic. The same factories that built that truck had also armed the army, now embracing their drivers as brothers. A few days later, in the outskirts of Berlin, a column of Studebakers delivered ammunition for the final push. The city was burning. Columns of refugees clogged the roads. Smoke blotted out the sky. Yet the trucks kept moving, their engines coughing through dust and flame. General Vasily Chuikov, commanding the 8th Guards Army, later said, "When we entered Berlin, the first vehicles I saw behind the tanks were Studebakers. They were filthy, bullet-riddled, but still running. They had followed us from the Don to the Reichstag." He wasn't exaggerating. Soviet inventories after the battle listed over 180,000 operational Lend-Lease trucks still in use, many of them having served since 1942. Even in the final days, they carried rations to infantry units in the rubble, evacuated wounded civilians, and transported prisoners of war. When the guns finally fell silent on May 9th, the trucks rested for the first time. their engines cooled beside the ruins of a city that symbolized the end of the war in Europe. Soviet soldiers climbed down from their cabs, exhausted and disbelieving. Some patted the hoods of their trucks as if thanking an old horse. In one photograph taken that morning near the Brandenburg Gate, a line of Studebakers stands beside T-34 tanks and Katyusha launchers. A Red Army flag flutters above them. On the bumper of one truck, someone had painted in chalk, "Made in U.S.A., finished in Berlin." Years later, at the 1985 Pacific and European Veterans Reunion in Hawaii, a Soviet general raised a glass and told his American counterpart, "You sent us food, steel, and guns. But the most important thing you sent was movement. Your trucks carried us to victory." The American veteran smiled. "And you drove them all the way to Berlin." Across oceans and decades, the engines had long fallen silent. But their legacy endured, in memoirs, in archives, and in the rusting hulks still scattered across Eastern Europe, buried in the forests they once conquered. For when the Red Army entered Berlin, it wasn't only an army of men and tanks, it was an army of machines from two worlds, capitalist and communist, rolling together toward the same victory. And in the grey dawn of May 1945, as the first Soviet truck rumbled past the Reichstag, its tyres grinding over cobblestones and ashes, the road to Berlin had finally ended, where it had always been heading since the first convoy left an American harbour 3 years before. April 1945. The ground trembled beneath the rolling thunder of artillery that never ceased. Soviet columns poured westward through the flattened ruins of East Prussia, across Poland, and into Germany itself. The snow was gone now, replaced by the churned mud of spring, and everywhere the same sound, the chugging rhythm of engines. Thousands upon thousands of them. From the Oder to the Spree, the Red Army's spearheads were no longer trudging on foot or hitched to weary horses. They rode high in the open backs of olive-drab Studebakers, Dodges and Fords, Lend-Lease trucks that had become as common to the Soviet soldier as the PPSH submachine gun. Their sides were battered, paint scoured by shrapnel and time, but they rolled on without complaint. Many bore Cyrillic graffiti, "Za Rodinu," for the motherland. Others had American factory stencils still visible beneath Soviet field paint. Major General Mikhail Katukov's 1st Guards Tank Army used them relentlessly. Fuel columns followed his T-34s in a chain of motion so constant it seemed mechanical. "We could not have kept pace without the American trucks," Katukov later admitted in a post-war symposium. "Our tanks outran the horse carts weeks before Berlin." By mid-April, 400,000 U.S. vehicles, nearly 200,000 of them Studebakers, had reached Soviet service. The Lend-Lease fleet carried artillery shells, food, bridging material, and wounded men back from the front. Soviet dispatch riders drove jeeps marked with red stars, leading convoys through bombed-out cities. A US-made GMC, seized by photographers near Kustrin, bore a slogan chalked in Russian, "To Berlin on Detroit rubber." Inside the city, the fight became a labyrinth of smoke and masonry. Trucks ferried ammunition directly to front-line battalions, reversing out of danger zones with engines howling. A Studebaker driven by Sergeant Pyotr Kravchenko carried a load of 122mm shells to within 800 meters of the Reichstag. "The truck never failed," he recalled. "The street was fire, and she still pulled like a horse." When the final assault began on April 30th, the Red Army's motorized brigades functioned with clockwork precision. Every gallon of gasoline, much of it American refined, shipped through Iran or Murmansk, fueled the drive that brought the hammer and sickle over Berlin. Soviet war correspondents wrote that, "Our engines never slept." By May 9th, 1945, it was over. Victory Day. Berlin was a ruin of smoke and silence. Rows of American trucks stood idling amid the wreckage, their cargo beds filled with soldiers cheering, waving flags and singing. One Soviet general, inspecting the streets around the Brandenburg Gate, reportedly muttered, half in disbelief, "Without these, we would still be in Smolensk." The Red Army's triumph was Soviet, but its wheels had come from overseas, built in Detroit, Akron, Cleveland, and shipped across oceans of ice. In the years that followed, few monuments were raised to them. But among veterans, the verdict was unanimous. The trucks had done their duty. And on their tires, the Soviet Union had rolled to Berlin. The war's echo lingered long after the guns fell silent. By summer 1945, the highways from Moscow to Berlin were littered with the husks of machines, burned-out half-tracks, shattered tanks, and everywhere trucks. Studebakers with broken axles, Dodges twisted by artillery fire, jeeps mired in the mud. Yet thousands still ran. Soviet engineers salvaged what they could, rebuilding convoys for the long journey home. At depots outside Warsaw and Minsk, Red Army mechanics held ceremonies of sorts. They painted over bullet holes, welded frames, and turned combat vehicles into supply haulers for peacetime reconstruction. "They had brought us to Berlin," one colonel wrote in his diary, "and they will now rebuild what Berlin destroyed." In the post-war Soviet press, the trucks received little mention. Stalin's government downplayed Lend-Lease, emphasizing domestic sacrifice and production. But among the officers and logisticians who had lived through it, memory was harder to suppress. Major General Kurochkin of the 3rd Belarusian Front said quietly during a veterans' reunion in 1958, "When we speak of victory, we must remember, our tanks were Russian, but our wheels were American." From 1941 to 1945, the United States delivered over 400,000 trucks, 12,000 tanks, 13,000 aircraft, and millions of tons of fuel, food, and ammunition to the USSR. It was a logistical feat without precedent. The Persian corridor alone moved more than 5 million tons of material. Each Studebaker that crossed the Caucasus carried not just supplies, but a link in an unbroken chain stretching from Detroit assembly lines to the battlefields of Europe. In later years, Soviet veterans spoke of those trucks with a mechanic's affection. The Studebaker US6s in particular became legendary, its powerful Hercules engine, its rugged suspension, its simplicity. Soviet designers studied it closely, and in 1947 the Gaz-51 truck appeared, its design unmistakably descended from the American model. The ghost of the Studebaker lived on in post-war Soviet industry. When the Cold War hardened the alliance into enmity, official histories rewrote the past. The Lend-Lease convoys became a secondary factor, their Western origins footnoted, their importance muted. But privately, the frontline men remembered. In memoirs smuggled to print or spoken in veterans' halls, the truth survived. The trucks had been their lifeline, the rhythm that kept the Red Army's heart beating. On the 40th anniversary of Victory Day in 1985, a group of surviving Soviet generals met in Moscow. They raised their glasses to fallen comrades, and then, to their astonishment, someone proposed another toast. "To the trucks," said Marshal Ivan Konev. The room fell silent for a moment, then filled with laughter and applause. The toast was simple, but it carried the weight of a continent moved by engines across half the world. Steel, oil, and rubber, bound by duty, welded by war. The arsenal of democracy had done its work. When the smoke cleared over Europe, the world's attention turned to the victors, the treaties, and the nuclear future that loomed. Yet, behind the headlines of diplomacy and power, there remained a quieter legacy. The story of the lifeline that had made the Red Army's victory physically possible. For every tank that had roared into Berlin, for every artillery battery that had fired across the Oder, a chain of logistics had stretched back across 3 continents and 3 oceans, and at its heart were trucks. The Studebaker US6, the GMCC CKW, the Dodge WC, these were not glamorous machines. They didn't make the front pages. They lacked the charisma of a Sherman tank or a Yak fighter. But ask any Soviet driver who crossed the steppes from Kursk to Königsberg, and the answer was the same. The trucks were our horses. By 1945, the Soviet Union had received an estimated 427,000 motor vehicles from the United States and Canada, nearly half the motor pool that carried its army into Central Europe. The numbers were staggering. US factories turned out an endless stream of 6x6s, each built to uniform standards that Soviet logisticians came to adore. They could be repaired in the field, swapped for parts, and pushed to their limits. Even when battered by frostbite temperatures or caked in mud, the Hercules engines of the Studebakers rarely failed. A post-war report from the Air Force Historical Research Agency summarized it plainly. No other vehicle contributed more materially to the Soviet advance than the Lend-Lease truck. But the trucks were more than supply carriers. They were mobile infrastructure. They bridged a technological gap between an agrarian army and a mechanized one. Soviet wartime production had prioritized tanks, guns, and planes, leaving a vacuum in transport vehicles. Lend-Lease filled it with an efficiency that astonished even the Americans delivering it. In a 1962 US-Japanese-Soviet aviation symposium, General Nikolai Lomov, by then a professor at the Frunze Military Academy, stated, "Without Lend-Lease transport, our offensives would have lagged by months. Our factories could not produce enough vehicles. The American truck became our artery." He was not exaggerating. Soviet manufacturing had built just over 200,000 trucks during the war, barely half of what was needed to sustain the enormous fronts stretching from Leningrad to the Black Sea. The remainder, the difference between movement and stagnation, came from convoys that braved the North Atlantic and the Persian corridor. The Arctic route to Murmansk was particularly hellish. Between 1941 and 1945, 78 convoys carried Lend-Lease cargo through seas patrolled by U-boats, Stuka bombers, and Arctic gales. Convoy PQ-17 became a tragedy of its own. 24 ships lost in a single operation. Yet the survivors kept coming. Soviet port officials recalled their first glimpse of US trucks being offloaded in 1942, rows of olive-drab giants towering above the icy docks, their tires still warm from the ship's hold. One Soviet railway dispatcher at Archangel remembered the day he read the first complete manifest labelled 10,000 Studebakers. He wrote later in his diary, now preserved in the Russian State Military Archive, "We had no idea America could make such numbers. Each ship that came seemed to carry a new miracle." From the ports, the trucks were reassembled, fueled, and driven south on perilous roads and frozen rivers. Soviet women, working as mechanics and drivers, kept them running under conditions that defied human endurance. The Persian corridor, stretching from the Persian Gulf through Iran and into the Caucasus, became the second artery of supply, one so efficient that by 1944 it delivered more tonnage than all other routes combined. General Donald Booth of the U.S. Army described it as a logistics victory within a war. Soviet soldiers affectionately nicknamed the trucks Studas. To them, the brand name itself became synonymous with reliability. They even wrote songs about them. One frontline ballad, recalled by Red Army veterans, went, "The Studa hauls our guns and bread through fire and snow, through the roads of the dead." When the Red Army launched Operation Bagration in June 1944, its rapid progress across Belarus stunned German intelligence. Wehrmacht analysts could not comprehend how Soviet forces were resupplying so quickly over such vast distances. The answer, revealed in post-war debriefings, was simple: mobility. The Soviets were now moving like an army of the West, fluid, motorized, self-sustaining. Colonel Yakov Cherepanov, a logistics officer with the 3rd Belarusian Front, later testified during the 1985 Veterans Reunion in Hawaii. "We captured the Germans' rail lines, but our true weapon was the American truck. It allowed us to bypass the bottlenecks, to carry fuel, ammunition, even bridging sections directly to our engineers. We learned to fight in motion. It was not only the trucks themselves, but the fuel that fed them. Lend-Lease delivered 2.5 million tons of aviation gasoline, lubricants, and motor oil, critical resources that Soviet refineries could not produce in sufficient quantity or quality. Many Soviet tank brigades used American rubber tires and spark plugs. Even their radios and field rations came in from overseas. When victory came, the official Soviet narrative shifted. Stalin, wary of political dependency, claimed the Red Army had triumphed primarily through its own strength. The Western aid that had filled Soviet warehouses was acknowledged only in passing. The trucks, stripped of their American stars, became silent veterans, rolling into post-war labor, hauling timber in Siberia, or transporting grain in the Urals. Still, some gestures of honesty endured. In 1946, Marshal Georgy Zhukov reportedly told a group of U.S. diplomats during a reception in Moscow, "You lent us the means of victory. Without the equipment we received through Lend-Lease, we could not have equipped our fronts nor moved our armies so quickly." His comment, unrecorded in Soviet press but preserved in U.S. diplomatic cables, reflected what every officer knew. The alliance between capitalist industry and communist necessity had won a brutal war neither side could have survived alone. As decades passed, the trucks aged and disappeared. A few Studebakers survived into the 1960s, their steel bodies patched and repainted. One was displayed in the Central Armed Forces Museum in Moscow, a relic of a time when global cooperation had briefly triumphed over ideology. Its engine was kept polished, its odometer frozen at 210,000 kilometers. When historians from both nations met again in 1985, during the 40th anniversary of the war's end, they raised a quiet toast. Not to politicians, not even to generals, but to the lifeline that spanned the oceans. An American delegate from the National World War II Museum recalled that a Soviet veteran, his uniform heavy with medals, leaned toward him and said in halting English, "We drove your trucks to Berlin. Tell your people they were good machines." Today, few remember the convoys, the drivers, or the men who kept those engines alive in the freezing dark of the Arctic. Yet without them, the Soviet flag might never have flown over the Reichstag. Steel, forged in America, rubber, molded in Ohio, oil, refined in Texas. All carried eastward across fire and water into the heart of a war that would define a century. It was, in the end, more than a convoy of trucks. It was proof, etched in iron and sweat, that industry could be as decisive as strategy, and that victory sometimes rides on wheels built an ocean away. In the years after 1945, the Lend-Lease convoys faded into memory, overshadowed by the Cold War that soon split the world into rival camps. The same steel that had united America and the Soviet Union in victory now forged the armor of suspicion. Yet beneath the new Iron Curtain, hundreds of thousands of those American-made trucks continued to work the same roads they had conquered, hauling grain instead of shells, timber instead of troops, and hope instead of destruction. From the vast plains of Kazakhstan to the logging camps of Karelia, Studebakers and Dodges lived second lives. Soviet drivers repainted them in peacetime grey and green, but the shape of their fenders and the bold stamp "Made in U.S.A." on their engine blocks never quite disappeared. In the 1950s, one could still find a convoy of them rolling through the Ural foothills, the same vehicles that had once thundered across the Oder. It was an irony of history. The Soviet Union, now locked in ideological combat with the West, rebuilt itself partly on the very machinery that the West had supplied. The arsenal of democracy had not merely armed the Red Army, it had modernized it. Soviet engineers studied every imported design, taking notes that would shape the next generation of domestic production. The Gaz-51, introduced in 1947, carried the unmistakable lineage of the Studebaker US6s, the same high clearance, the same load balance, the same reliability on rough terrain. At the 1962 U.S.-Japanese-Soviet Aviation and Logistics Symposium, General Lomov, who had once commanded supply routes in the Western Front, gave a rare public admission. We learned from those machines. They were not just trucks, they were teachers. They showed us how an army moves by industry. His remark, though modestly phrased, reflected a truth that Soviet propaganda had long buried. The Red Army's ability to wage modern mobile warfare had been born not only in Soviet factories, but in the assembly lines of Detroit, Cleveland, and Toledo. The same production miracles that had supplied the U.S. Army in Normandy had kept the Red Army rolling to Berlin. In post-war America, too, the Lend-Lease story was largely forgotten. The public preferred tales of their own triumphs: D-Day, the Pacific Island campaigns, the Atomic Age. Few Americans realized that one of their country's greatest wartime legacies was not the bomb or the battleship, but the humble 6x6 truck. In total, over 18 million tons of material were sent to the U.S.A, worth more than $11 billion at wartime value. It was the most extensive act of industrial diplomacy in history. The men who had risked their lives to deliver it seldom received the same glory as the soldiers they supplied. Sailors of the Arctic convoys endured temperatures below zero, constant U-boat attacks, and Luftwaffe bombings. 1 in 10 ships never returned. Veterans of those routes called themselves the ghosts of the Barents Sea. A 1946 debriefing from the U.S. Navy noted, "No route in the world's oceans has ever demanded such courage from those who sailed it." At Murmansk, local Russians still remember the explosions that lit the horizon when convoys arrived under fire. Decades later, when Arctic ice melted enough to reveal the remains of sunken Liberty ships, divers found Studebaker engines and crates of spare tires resting on the seabed, ghosts of the arsenal that never reached shore. Meanwhile, the veterans who had driven those trucks to Berlin grew old. In Moscow, a former Red Army driver named Yegorov kept a small photo of his wartime Studebaker pinned above his kitchen table. In his memoir, published in 1979, he wrote, "It was not just a machine. It was my companion through snow and fire. I gave her a name, Amerikanka. When Berlin fell, I felt I owed her a salute." By the 1980s, few of those trucks were left running. The Soviet Union had produced newer, heavier models. Yet in remote areas, villages along the Volga, mines in Siberia, airfields in the Far East, some Studebakers still rumbled to life every morning, their odometers long broken, their engines rebuilt again and again. Mechanics called them immortal. In 1985, at the Pacific Theater Veterans Reunion in Hawaii, surviving American and Soviet veterans met under one roof for the first time. They exchanged stories, photographs, and translations of diaries. When the subject of Lend-Lease arose, a retired Soviet general named Morozov lifted his glass and said in English, "To the trucks that carried victory." An American naval officer replied, "And to the men who drove them through hell to get there." The room fell into applause. It was a small reconciliation, one forged not in politics but in shared memory. Years later, when the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, historians began to re-evaluate the role of Lend-Lease. Newly opened archives revealed just how decisive it had been, that 1 in every 3 Red Army vehicles had been American-built, that half the aviation fuel burned by Soviet aircraft came from U.S. refineries, and that more than 57% of the Red Army's radios, cables, and transport tires were imported. The data shocked even Russian scholars. In 2005, during the 60th anniversary of Victory Day, President Vladimir Putin invited U.S. veterans of the Arctic convoys to Moscow as honored guests. Standing beneath the red banners of the Kremlin, they watched as a restored Studebaker rolled through Red Square, engine rebuilt, tires replaced, body gleaming like new. The crowd applauded as it passed, and a Soviet veteran saluted. The world had changed, alliances had shattered and reformed, but the memory of steel and endurance endured. The trucks were long gone, but the roads they opened, from the Arctic ports to Berlin, remained a symbol of what industrial might and shared sacrifice could achieve. The Red Army may have planted the flag over the Reichstag, but the wheels that carried it there were forged in America, shipped through hell, and driven by men who believed, if only for a brief burning moment, that unity could defeat tyranny. And so the legacy of 400,000 US trucks lives on, not in museums or textbooks, but in the enduring truth that victory is not only won by those who fight, but by those who build, deliver, and drive the world forward.